Hi everyone, my name is Jenny, and today I'm going to be going over all the books that I read in the last little part of 2021. As you may have noticed, I've not done a wrap-up since August of 2021, which I'll put a link to up in the cards above, but I did want to wrap up all the books that I read in these last 4 months, so I figured I would just quickly go over all 26 of them. Now, I do also always write book reviews on Goodreads, and I'm also trying to put them on Storygraph now as well as we move into 2022. So those I always write like right after I finish the book, so you can always like follow me on Goodreads or on Storygraph to see my most up-to-date thoughts on any of the books that I am reading or have read. Starting way back in September, I read 3 books, and the first of those was The Ones We're Meant to Find by Joan He. This I gave 2.5 stars to, and this is a YA science fiction book that was marketed as a book about 2 sisters and set in like a ravaged by climate change future, and I thought it was going to be primarily exploring those 2 themes. Unfortunately, neither of those things were really the focus of the book. In fact, while it was about sisters, there was another science fiction plot that really was revealed about 2/3 of the way through the book, so I don't want to spoil it, that I don't care anything about. So I didn't really like that element of it. I also wish there had been more of this kind of sibling sisterhood dynamic that I was looking for. I also was kind of confused, particularly in the last third, about like character motivations and why things were happening the way they did. I didn't find the ending very satisfying, so all in all, big letdown. But on Storygraph, which I figured since I am trying to incorporate Storygraph more in 2022, I would give you the feelings that I use to describe each of the books that I'm going to be talking about. So for The Ones We're Meant to Find, I described this book as adventurous. Next up, I read Beautiful World, Where Are You by Sally Rooney. This was one of the books that I read for my 5-star prediction blog. This was one of my few actual 5-star reads. This is Sally Rooney's 3rd novel. I've read all 3 of her novels. She's probably my favorite novelist writing today because I'm just a classic millennial 24-year-old like that. And this one is about 2 friends who were best friends in uni, and now they're like 29, 30, and they're budding like romantic relationships with 2 different men. And the 2 female best friends write emails to one another, which a lot of people have kind of taken issue with the emails. But for me, I love the emails. I think they're my favorite part, particularly given that Sally Rooney is grappling with a lot of ideas that I also think about and also discuss with my friends, and so it felt very real to me. I also really liked the juxtaposition between the existential emails that are really big thinky energy and the very mundane elements of their everyday lives that we talk about in the rest of the novel. It felt very true to life. You often are having these big existential moments that in the grand scheme of things are meaningless. I also found the way she depicted the 2 friends to be really satisfying and described it on Storygraph as funny, hopeful, and reflective. The last book that I finished in September was My Education by Susan Choi, and I ended up giving it 3 stars. I read this one because it takes place in grad school, and I was just starting grad school, so I figured it was an appropriate time to read this book. It's a literary fiction novel following a young woman in the 1990s who's starting a master's degree or maybe a PhD in English. Either way, she doesn't finish it, so spoiler alert there. But she also begins a very tumultuous affair with a married faculty member, and honestly, the first like 200 pages or so are diving deep into this summer that she and this faculty member are having this affair, and they are both so incredibly insufferable and pretentious that I was really frustrated with those first 200 pages. Almost gave up on the book several times, but I continued through to the last third where we jump ahead to, I believe, 2007, so about 15 years after the first 200 pages, and honestly, I loved the 2007 section. I think the characters grew a lot. Even though it happened off page, it made a lot of sense, and I also think that the way that things got tied up was really effective and moving, particularly the like very end scene. I thought was just absolutely perfect. One of the best endings to a book that I've read in a really long time. So that kind of salvaged the book for me, but would I recommend this? I don't think so, because it was pretty insufferable for like the vast majority of the book. So on Storygraph, I said that this one was challenging and reflective. Moving into October, I read 5 books, I think. The first of those was Say Nothing by Petra Cradden Keefe. This one I also talked about in that 5-star prediction blog, and it's a nonfiction book about the Troubles, and I found the writing style compelling. I can definitely see why a lot of people here on BookTube really enjoyed this one, but I do wish it provided more like political context about the Troubles, as that was just not something that I really know a lot about, and so I was kind of confused about how different players fit into the larger scheme of things, and also what the fight was really for and what it accomplished. I also found, because it was so focused on like the individual players, that there were a lot of just like really minute details that I struggled to like grasp and like fully contextualize within the larger story. That also meant that because these were people that were key players within the Troubles, which was a civil war, that there was a lot of really dark and graphic things that he describes in detail that I just had difficulty reading about sometimes. On Storygraph, I rated this one dark, informative, and mysterious. The next book I also talked about in a reading vlog. This was a little Halloweeny, like October fall break reading vlog, with Ex Hex by Erin Sterling. This one I gave 4 stars to, and it's a super cute little Halloweeny rom-com about a woman who's a witch who has an affair with a young man who's a warlock witch, but he and her went to this university, which is where the young woman still lives, in this small college town, and then he left to go back to Wales. And they've still been like thinking about each other over the course of the 9 years that they've been separated, but since they left their relationship so unanswered, she, in her kind of depression about him leaving and breaking up with her, actually accidentally cursed him. And so when he comes back to the town for some reasons related to his family and his family's role in the town, he actually is cursed. And so the whole town is cursed, and they have to both work together to stop the curse. So it was super cute, super hilarious. Like, I laughed out loud several times, which is kind of rare for me to do in a book. I also really just liked the hijinks. It was super silly and kind of campy and fun, very similar to like a Hocus Pocus vibe. Super fast paced. I read it over the course of a single day, and on Storygraph I described this one as funny and lighthearted. Then the next book that I finished in October was The Survivors by Jane Harper. I gave this 3.5 stars. This was probably one of my less successful works with her. This is a mystery set in a like small seaside town, I think in Tasmania, if I'm not mistaken, somewhere in Australia. And a tragedy has happened in a family 10 years ago, and our main character, whose name I don't remember, left the town shortly after that and hasn't really returned since, but he has returned now to like visit his family for the first time in a really long time. And another tragedy happens, and that kind of reopens both the like mystery that happened 10 years ago and also like the mystery of who was murdered and why they were murdered in the present day. I think Jane Harper really excels at exploring familial relationships and healing from family trauma, and this one definitely had a lot of that. Particularly, there's a lot of guilt that the main character feels about the event that happened 10 years ago that I think gets kind of healed over the course of this book. However, during this book, I really was convinced that one character was the murderer of the like present day timeline. And actually, I thought he was the murderer of both timelines. And so I kind of lost interest because I was like, oh, this is so obvious. And then when it wasn't him, I was like kind of disappointed that I hadn't been as invested in the story, because I probably would have picked up on other clues had I not been like so sure that it was this one character. She set up the red herrings like a little too well, to the point that I wasn't interested and as invested in the story as I could have been. And the Storygraph feelings I used to describe this book were adventurous and mysterious. The next book that I read in October was Secret Lives of Church Ladies by Deesha Philay. This was another one of those 5-star prediction books, and it's a really solid short story collection. I ended up giving this 4.5 stars that explores being a Black Southern person and how closely tied that is to like the cultural experience of Christianity in America. And so I found those themes really interesting. I feel like all the stories were really well done. However, none of them like absolutely blew me away or were stories that I think will stick with me forever. In fact, even now I remember the plot of my favorite stories, but there were not like really standout moments in those stories as there are with other favorite short stories of mine. But the favorites from the collection were probably Snowfall and How to Love a Physicist, and the Storygraph feeling I used to describe this book was reflective, which I do believe is the word that describes the most of my books on Storygraph, which makes sense because I do love a reflective book. The last book that I finished in October was When No One Is Watching by Alyssa Cole. This one I gave 4 stars to, and is a tense, I don't want to call it thriller, it's almost horror, except I'm not entirely sure it's horror. I guess it's like realistic horror. It's about gentrification in Brooklyn, and we follow our main character, who's a young Black woman whose family has lived in this historically Black neighborhood, and she is really interested in that history of the ways that this neighborhood has kind of functioned as a Black community, but there are a bunch of upper middle class white people that are moving into the neighborhood, in part because there's a company, like a medical telehealth company, that's moving in as well. And so there's then some kind of sinister things that are happening related to the white people moving into the neighborhood as well as the telehealth company, and things just kind of become absolutely wild from there. I think this book really worked most well for me because during the time that I was reading this, I was also discussing gentrification gentrification and its impacts in a class that I was taking. And so it really kind of complemented very nicely a lot of the more academic texts that I was reading at that time. But on the flip side of that, I did find things were a little too like spelled out. I also didn't like that there was like a romance that was kind of thrown in there. I didn't think it was necessary or really added much to the story. Particularly, there's a sex scene that happens about like 2/3, 3/4 of the way through the book that just like really threw off the whole flow of the rest of the book. I also found the pacing, especially towards the end, to be like a little intense, and I think could have been stretched out a bit more. And the storygraph feelings I used to describe this book were informative, mysterious, and intense. Moving into November, I did try to complete a few nonfiction books for Nonfiction November, and also the first book that I finished, Mind Spread Out on the Ground by Alicia Elliott, counted towards Indigathon. This is a nonfiction essay collection by Alicia Elliott, who is Haudenosaunee, I think is how you say that, which is an indigenous group that's native to the Great Lakes region of like Ontario and upstate New York. And I ended up giving this collection 4.5 stars. I think it's a really strong mix of cultural criticism and personal essays, which personal essays are not usually my thing, but I think the way that she does them here by grounding them in larger political issues or kind of more philosophical musings, I think was really successful. I also found that each essay stood really effectively on its own, but as a whole, the essay collection also kind of complemented one another, which I think is the way that an essay collection should be. Particularly if you like personal essays, I would highly, highly recommend this collection, as I thought it was just super strong. So the storygraph feelings I used to describe this book were challenging, informative, and reflective. Next, I read the poetry magazine from March of 2021, and this one was actually sent to me from Stephanie at Time to Read, who I'll put a link to down in the description box below, as well as another book that I'll talk about later in this video. And this one I don't remember a ton about. It was like a short poetry collection. I believe this was like young people's poetry, which I'm not really sure what that means, but I enjoyed the poems. I definitely would be interested to read more from the poetry magazine, as I am trying to get more into poetry, but none of the poems here really like super stand out for me, so I only ended up giving this 3 stars. And the storygraph feeling I used to describe this book was reflective. The next book that I finished in November was part of a deep dive that I was doing into like progressive Christianity at the time, which was What is the Bible by Rob Bell. I heard about Rob Bell from Jill at the Book Bully, who I'll also put a link to down in the description box below, but also at that same time was kind of thinking a lot about progressive Christianity and what that means for my own kind of theological beliefs. So I picked this book up and just absolutely loved it. Rob Bell is a former evangelical minister from Michigan, but he actually left his church after he published a book about heaven and hell and how the Bible doesn't actually say that hell exists. And so this idea of kind of evangelicalism that really focuses on like eternal damnation is totally made up to like scare people into obeying the ideas of the minister. So that really did not go over well with his evangelical community. So he left the evangelical community and since then has really been focusing on really going back to the roots of the Bible, which it seems is what progressive Christianity is all about. And this book is basically just an exploration of that, what the Bible is actually saying, what it's about, the fact that it's a story of the oppressed rising up against their oppressor, and a story of radical love and acceptance, and just all of these things that I find to be the most pertinent elements of Christianity. He really kind of dives in deep with those themes and talks about them in a really beautiful and like powerful way. So I love this book. I give it 5 stars, would highly recommend if you are interested in kind of diving deeper into like progressive Christianity and its theology. And I also listened to this one on audio, and Rob Bell narrates it himself, and he's a great speaker. Given that he has a history of being a minister, you know, that makes sense. It feels very kind of sermon-y, so if that's not your thing, perhaps you would not like this one on audio. And I don't know how well it would read in print, because it does really feel like something that you should listen to, and I can't wait to read more from him. On Storygraph, I describe this one as emotional, funny, hopeful, and informative. Another nonfiction book I read during November was The Cooking Gene by Michael Twitty. This one I also talked about in that 5-star prediction vlog, and I gave this one 4.5 stars. And this is kind of a mix of Michael Twitty's memoir and a broader history of African-American cuisine, and particularly the connections of West African cuisine with Creole Cajun cuisine, as well as like Low Country cuisine. I really liked that kind of deep archival research that Michael Twitty did. I also really liked his more genetic, genomic research on when his ancestors first actually were brought to the Americas. I thought that part was really fascinating, although he does dive pretty deep into like how genomic research works, which as a biology major in undergrad, I actually took a whole class on that, so that was less exciting and intriguing to me. And the Strogoff feelings I used to describe this one were challenging, informative, and reflective. Finally, the last book I read in November was Something New Under the Sun by Alexandra Kleeman. This one I read with my book club besties, who are my two best friends from undergrad, and I gave this one 3 stars. I didn't really like it that much, and it's a literary fiction novel that came out this year. Oh, and this one I actually read as an ARC from Nick Kelly. So it came out, I believe, in August, and this one's set in the near future and is about an author who has written a book that's being adapted into a movie in Hollywood, and he is an executive producer on the movie. So he goes to Hollywood and weird things start happening both with the movie and what the movie's financial resources are actually going towards, as well as some weird stuff about water availability and this interesting new technology that's called Water, W-A-T-R. The book's main focus is about the climate crisis and droughts in Southern California, but honestly none of that really touched or impacted me in much of a way, despite the fact that I'm very interested in the climate crisis and thinking about climate change. And I think that's in part because the book was just so focused on the doom of climate change and that there's nothing we can do and humans are hopeless to stopping climate change. I also found it to be just a really weird book. There was a lot of weird elements to it that I think just didn't come together very cohesively. One of my best friends in book club actually said that she wishes that Alexandra Kleeman had finished the book, because it does just kind of end and nothing gets resolved. I didn't really like it that much. I wouldn't really recommend it. At times, on a sentence by sentence level, the writing was really beautiful and it had some really poignant moments, but as a whole cohesive story, it did not really work at all. So this one on Storygraph, I used the words adventurous, dark, and tense to describe this book. Now moving into December, when I read quite a few books. The first of those was a very steamy holiday romance, which was Window Shopping by Tessa Bailey. It's a novella and it's about a woman who's just been released from prison, and she's in New York City, and she happens upon a manager of a department store, and they strike up a conversation about the window display that she is looking at, and she has always wanted to be in fashion marketing, and so she and the store manager strike up a conversation about how terrible this window display is, and he just gives her a job of here, you can do our window displays for the holiday season. So she begins working there, but they also, because it's a romance novella, have an instant attraction to one another, and they have sex, and then she gets the job and the novella's done. It's Christmas. It was fine. I definitely skimmed it towards the end, particularly during the second half. It's pretty sex heavy, which if you've read Tessa Bailey, you know that she really loves to go on the steam train, and so that I didn't really care, especially since it was a novella. I didn't really feel their chemistry all that much. I also, as someone who works in retail, didn't understand the female main character, whose name I don't remember, kept being wow, the price tag on our clothes is so expensive, and I'm yeah, that's why there's an employee discount at the store that you work at. There were also just a couple other things, and I was that's not how working retail work, but it was a cute romance, good for the kind of lack of brain energy towards reading that I had around the time that I read this book. And then the Storygraph feeling I used to describe this one was lighthearted. Another one of those 5-star prediction books I also read in the beginning of December, and that was Yellowbird by C.R. Crane Murdoch. This one I gave 5 stars to. It was the other 5-star success of that vlog, and this one is a long form journalism book similar to articles in the New Yorker or the Atlantic, that is one part almost biography of a woman by the name of Lisa Yellowbird, who is Arikara, and her life story and also her family, and then it's also one part a discussion of the reservation that Lisa Yellowbird is from, which is the Fort Berthold Indian Reservation, and the tribal politics there, both historically, within the last 60 years or so, as there was a dam built on the reservation land by the Army Corps of Engineers, also of more recent tribal politics related to the finances of the tribe. And then the third part was this true crime element of a young man who had gone missing from one of the oil rigs that was on the reservation, as in the early 2010s, the reservation became one of the hubs in North Dakota for the fracking industry. So that true crime element is also tied to Lisa Yellowbird, who became really interested in this particular case. So it's kind of a blending of all three of those things in what I found to be really effective and compelling. I also think C.R. Crane Murdoch, despite being a white author, really positioned herself, particularly in the author's note, in a way that felt really honest, and that I think kind of gave greater meaning to like the story that she was telling. Would highly recommend if kind of genre bending nonfiction is your style. And the story graph feelings I used to describe this book were challenging, informative, mysterious, and reflective. Then the other book that I got from Stephanie from Time to Read is The Home Place by J. Drew Lanham. This book I gave 4 stars to, and is a nature-y memoir that reads very similarly to me as Robin Wall Kimmerer's writing Sweetgrass, except as opposed to being an indigenous person like Kimmerer, J. Drew Lanham is a black man from rural South Carolina. And this book basically tells his life story of growing up with his grandmother, who was very interested in kind of more traditional medicinal practices that probably date back to West Africa and then through the enslavement of African American people in the United States. And so that is kind of one element of the development of his love of nature, but then also just kind of talks about his familial life growing up, and then as he gets older, like with his wife and his children. He also reflects on the racism that exists within the field of conservation biology, and then the racism more broadly within enjoying the outdoors and the kind of limits of access to the outdoors for non-white people. I thought that part was probably the most compelling part of the book, and I would recommend this book for that reason. And the story graph feelings I used to describe this one were informative and reflective. Then on a similar note, and actually published by the same publisher, Milkweed, which I thought was kind of funny, I read The Seedkeeper by Dan Wilson. This is the last of those 5-star prediction books that I read, and this one I gave 4.5 stars and takes place in Minnesota and follows a young Dakota woman named Rosalie, who's put into the foster care system after the death of her father, and eventually marries a white farmer who lives in the town that she was kind of placed into. And so from there, the novel kind of follows 2 different timelines, the first of which being one set in like the 1970s following her marriage to this young white farmer, and then like her life with him and the child they have, etc. And then the other timeline is a more present day timeline, although I think it's still like 2002 or 3. After the death of her husband, our main character Rosalie like returns back to the reservation and kind of learns more about her family's history. And alongside that, there is actually a third timeline that is more historical in nature, talking about the violent interactions between the Dakota people who were living in Minnesota in the 1800s as white people began to settle into Minnesota. And I thought the writing and themes were pretty strong. I don't think they were totally standout, which is why I didn't give it a full 5 stars, but I still would really recommend this one. Again, if you like nature writing in particular or like family stories, I think this one like was really excellent in both of those categories. And then this one on Storygraph, I used the words emotional and reflective to describe this book. The next book I read, I also talked about in a reading blog that I just posted a couple weeks ago, and that was The Holiday Swap by Maggie Knox. This one I gave 3 stars to. It's like a cute holiday romance that is about 2 twin sisters who swap places. Honestly, I wish it was more Christmassy as I did with the other holiday romance. I also didn't like the main reason that they were swapped, which was that one of them had a concussion that was never really medically addressed. I also thought they were really bad at like being swapped. They didn't really know much about each other's lives, which is part of the point of the story, but I just wish that they had like known a little bit more about one another's lives, because some of the moments that happened because of that just felt a little stupid. Definitely not a new favorite. And this one I described on Storygraph as adventurous and lighthearted. The next book that I finished in this last little bit of December was Troubling Love by Elena Ferrante. This one I also gave 3 stars to, and it's Ferrante's debut novel, which is about a woman who's returning home to Naples after the death of her mother and is kind of learning more about her mother's later life and perhaps the romantic relationships that she had. And you can definitely see that like early explorations of themes that Ferrante really breaks open in the Neapolitan Quartet, such as male violence, female friendships, mother-daughter relationships, but I feel like they all felt a bit less developed. I mean, it makes sense because she was not the writer that she was when she wrote the Neapolitan Quartet. Additionally, you can also see the kind of more messiness of her writing style that I think becomes a lot more crisp in her later work, but I did still find those themes interesting, and I liked the kind of more meta aspect of reading an earlier book and seeing the way that those thoughts and themes have been transformed as she kind of became stronger in her writing. I also, though, was a bit confused about some of the elements of the plot, particularly given that this book is only about 140 pages and a lot happens. Particularly, I think there's some like flashback elements that just were not really made super clear. I also, though, had gotten my COVID booster the day before, so that may be why I was confused. I honestly don't really know. And then the Storygraph feelings I used to describe this one were dark, mysterious, and tense. The next book I finished was The Conscious Closet by Elizabeth Klein. This is really more of a like how-to book on how to live out your values related to like social and environmental causes through your wardrobe, and less so like a book that you'd read cover to cover, although that is what I did. And I think I'll definitely have to return to this book and like read certain sections again as I begin to implement some of the strategies that she talks about here. But I still gave it 5 stars just because I thought it was super informative, and I think is just a really good definitive guide of how to accomplish a more like environmentally conscious and just like long-lasting wardrobe, if that's something you're interested in. So definitely, if this type of project speaks to you, I would recommend checking this book out, as I think you would probably learn a lot from it. So on Storygraph, I did describe this one as informative. And then the last book that I read in December that was not a little ARC catch-up project that I'll talk about in just a minute was The Death of Vivek Oji by Kweki Emezi. This one I gave 3 stars to, and it's a pretty popular literary fiction book here on BookTube about Vivek Oji and their life. I thought the writing here was good. It didn't capture me as much as I think it has for other readers, and I also think it could have been longer and more fleshed out, as things felt just not as developed as I think they could have been. I also really struggled with a like romantic / sexual relationship that develops between 2 family members. While I think that was intentional as a way to kind of challenge the perspectives of the reader, it just still, I don't know, it didn't quite work for me. And on Storygraph, I described it as challenging, reflective, and sad. In addition to all of those other books that I read in that last little bit of December, I also wanted to catch up on all of the ARCs that I received through NetGalley that had come out sometime earlier in 2021 that I wasn't able to get to. So the first of those was Fault Lines by Emily Atami, which came out in September. And this one I gave 3.5 stars to, and it's kind of a millennial fiction-y novel of the likes of like Sally Rooney or Candace Carty-Williams, that is about a young wife and mother who's living in Tokyo with her husband, but she's really unhappy with being a housewife. She in the past has been a singer, and she lived abroad in America for a bit, and she just is not feeling that her life is really being fulfilled. So she eventually begins a kind of fraught relationship with another man. Honestly, this novel was solid. I think the places it shines the most are its reflections on motherhood and loneliness and wishing more for your life. And honestly, I think the affair was probably the weakest part of the novel. I definitely would read more of Itami's work, as I think this was her debut. So the Storygraph feelings I used to describe this book were funny and reflective. The next book that I read was Sankova by Tubunda Inuzu. This one came out in October, and I gave 4.5 stars to this book, which is somewhere between like a commercial and literary fiction novel about a mixed race woman named Anna who has lived her entire life in the UK, and she was raised by her single white mother. And the book opens with the death of Anna's mother and her beginning to explore who her father is. And so the first half of the novel is Anna kind of doing research on her father, who ends up being a pretty prominent political figure in the fictional West African country that he is from. And so the second half of the novel then is about her traveling to this fictional country and meeting her father and meeting her father's family and kind of learning about that aspect of her ancestry. So I enjoyed the first half of the novel a lot more than I enjoyed the second half. However, I think the second half was still compelling, and I particularly loved the ending of this book as well. And I think it ties back to the crux of the novel, which is Anna's grief about her mother. It also reminded me quite a bit of Queenie by Candace Carty-Williams, as I think both books, despite the fact that Queenie is about like a young woman and Anna is in her 40s, I think both books really touch on the ways that the colonial projects of the UK impact family dynamics of people who trace their ancestry to a former colony of the UK, but also this idea of feeling like an outsider in England because of that ancestry, despite being from England and like England being the only home you've ever known. I think both of those books touch on those themes in really similar ways, and also just feeling lost in your place in life. So I think if you liked Queenie, you may like Sankofa as well. And then this one on Storygraph I described as emotional, inspiring, and reflective. The next one I read was 5 Tuesdays in Winter by Lily King. This came out in the beginning of November, and I gave this 4 stars. This is a short story collection by King that really, I think, showcases what she does best, which is very nostalgic stories about upper middle class New Englanders. And unfortunately for me, I loved the first 3 stories of this collection, and then the next 7 or so really did not live up to those first 3, so that's why I only gave it 4 stars. But I did still enjoy the collection and would recommend it. My favorite story, which was one of my favorite stories of the whole year, was When in Dordogne. I think is how you say that. It's a French place, and I don't speak French. But this story was about a young teenage boy whose parents are going to France for the summer, and so he gets taken care of by 2 young men who are in college at the university where his father teaches. And It's basically just a coming of age story about that summer, and it's framed within the young boy like looking back on this time and realizing how kind of important this summer was to him and his like development as a person. And I just loved it. I think the ending really, in particular, it really stuck the landing, which I think is what makes a short story so good. Perhaps worth it to check out this collection just to read that story. If you like stories that are kind of about nostalgia and coming of age, I think this was a really successful one. And the storygraph feelings I used to describe this book were emotional and reflective. Then the next one I read was The Loneliest Americans by J. Caspian Kang. This one came out on October 12th, and I gave this one 4 stars. This was a nonfiction book that was another kind of blending of different genres of nonfiction. So it blended like recent history of Asian American people, a memoir, and also essays of cultural criticism. And all of those things kind of came together to explore Kang's thesis, which is basically that Asian American individuals, particularly those who arrived to America after the Hart-Celler Act of the 1960s, basically do not have a common lived experience that allows them to be grouped into this like racial category of Asian Americans. And that therefore like complicates the narrative surrounding race in America. So this book I thought was super thought-provoking. It made me think about a lot of things and want to research and like learn more and read more books about a lot of topics that he kind of mentions in passing here. I think this book is rife for expanding upon, and I think it easily could have been longer had he chosen to kind of dive deeper into some of these ideas, which I think was my critique of the book, is that it felt in a lot of ways unfinished. And I don't think that's because the book itself was unfinished, but I think because the ideas that Kang is grappling with here are so complex that he himself is not like done thinking about them, and I don't think his thinking around these ideas has like reached its final evolution. So I'll be really curious to like continue reading his work as he continues to grapple with these ideas and begin kind of transforming some of the thoughts that he explores here into kind of more cohesive arguments, as this felt just kind of, I don't know, very exploratory of a lot of different threads, but did not tie them together super cohesively. But I think that perhaps could have been done better had this book either been more of a memoir or more of a cohesive essay collection with each chapter kind of being able to stand on its own, which I don't entirely think was the case, but instead the chapters kind of read like loose essays, but he tried to thread them together. And on Storygraph, I described it as challenging, informative, and reflective. Then to round out the year, the book that I started and finished on the 31st of December was Tides by Sarah Freeman, which actually does not come out until January 18th of 2022. And this one I gave 2 stars to. I did not like it. It's one of those very like insular literary fiction novels about a depressed woman, and no one really says anything, and it's all just her thoughts. And this woman moves to like a seaside town, and because her marriage is falling apart. And I think there was also some threads of perhaps a miscarriage that impacted her marriage, and so this woman is kind of falling apart and moves to this town, and she begins in this town a very tumultuous relationship with a married man, and that does not go well. And honestly, I didn't like it. I didn't think it was fleshed out at all. Like, I think there could have been a lot more explained or a lot more explored. I also thought that the writing felt really overdone to the point that some of the lines, I mean, I'm not a person who like calls out lines in their videos that I really didn't like, but I'm sure you've seen people do that, and that's something that I feel like I could have done with this book, because the language was just sometimes illogical and the imagery that it was presenting just did not make sense. Also, there's a sibling relationship here. Our main female character has a brother, and they have a very fraught relationship that I didn't really understand why it went to some places that I didn't really think it needed to go, so I didn't really understand that element. And like, her brother was like a big part of the book, and I was like, okay, but he's your brother. So yeah, not a huge fan of this book, would not really recommend it, was a miss for me. And so on Storygraph, I described this book as dark and sad. So those are all of the 26 books that I have read since the start of September. But if you have read any of these books, please feel free to talk to me about them down in the comment section below. Additionally, if you have any book recommendations or just other thoughts you want to share with me, as always, just let me know down in the comment section below. If you're new to my channel, I'd love to have you stick around and subscribe. I hope you're having a great rest of your day and a great start to 2022 whenever you're watching this, and I will talk to you next time.